The clock above the kitchen door ticked louder than it ever had before. Each second sounded like a countdown I didn't know I was part of. My family sat around the table in perfect symmetry. 4 plates, 4 glasses, 4 people pretending to be normal. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered rolls should have felt comforting, but tonight, it carried the heaviness of something final. Across from me, my brother leaned back in his chair, chewing slowly, like he had all the power in the world. Then he said it, so casually it almost didn't sound real. "You have 1 week to leave." The words floated across the table, soft, confident, cruel. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. For a second I thought I'd misheard him, but then he smirked. That smirk, one corner of his mouth curling up like he'd just scored a silent victory. I waited for my parents to react. Surely Mom would tell him to stop joking. Surely Dad would at least look uncomfortable. But they didn't. Mom cut another piece of chicken. Dad adjusted his napkin. Silence filled every space between us, pressing against my ribs like a weight I couldn't lift. That was the moment I realized something horrifying. This wasn't just my brother's decision, it was theirs too. They'd all agreed, without me, without warning, that my time here was over. My pulse drummed in my ears. The lights above flickered, and for a second I thought maybe I'd pass out. But I didn't. I just sat there, still watching the family I'd supported, loved and defended look at me as if I were already gone. I wanted to ask why. But deep down, I already knew. Because in this family, love wasn't earned, it was assigned. And I'd never been the chosen one. The silence after his sentence stretched so long it started to hum. The air tasted like metal, like betrayal and fear mixed together. Finally, I whispered, "You can't be serious." He laughed. "Oh, I'm serious, Steph. You've been squatting here long enough." Squatting. He made it sound like I was some stranger, not the daughter who'd kept the mortgage afloat for 2 years when Dad lost his job. Mom didn't even look up. She just murmured, "It's for the best, sweetheart. You've been here too long, too long." At 29, apparently, I'd overstayed my welcome in the house I once called home. I stared at the 3 of them and realized I could scream until my throat tore apart, and it wouldn't change a thing. They'd made their decision long before dinner. So instead, I smiled, a small, bitter thing that tasted like surrender but felt like armor. "Fine," I said. My voice didn't shake, and that scared them more than any argument could have. Inside, my thoughts spun like a storm. After everything I've done for them, after all the times I said yes when they never said thank you, but I kept my mouth shut, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the beginning of something far stronger. He kept talking, filling the space with meaningless justifications, something about how it was time for me to move on, how everyone needs their own space. Mom nodded like she'd rehearsed the lines. Dad sighed, pretending to be the peacemaker, pretending this was practical. And me? I was memorizing every sound, every flicker of candlelight on their faces, every lie disguised as kindness. When you've spent your whole life trying to be seen, and the people closest to you look right through you, something inside finally clicks. It's not pain anymore, it's clarity. I realized that night I'd been living in their version of love. Conditional, convenient, temporary. They only needed me when I could solve something for them. And now that everything looked stable again, I was disposable. So I nodded along as if I agreed. But inside I was already planning my exit, not just from the house, but from the pattern that had kept me small. Later that evening, after they'd all gone to bed, I sat in the living room surrounded by quiet. The same walls that had once echoed with childhood laughter now felt like strangers watching me pack invisible bags. I touched the edge of the dining table, the one my father had built when I was 10, and wondered if he even remembered that. Probably not. In this house, memories only mattered when they belonged to someone else. I thought about the countless nights I'd stayed up transferring money into Mom's account, labeling it groceries or electric bill. They never asked where the funds came from. They just assumed my brother was helping. Of course they did, because in their story, he was always the hero. I wanted to cry. But instead, I made a quiet promise to myself. They'd taken my peace for years, but they'd never take my dignity again. If they wanted me gone in a week, fine. I'd leave, but not before making sure the truth finally spoke for itself. And that's where it all began, the moment my silence turned into strategy. That dinner wasn't just an ending, it was the start of a new chapter they'd never see coming. By the end of that week, they would finally understand what it feels like to lose something they never appreciated. My name is Stephanie, and I used to think love meant loyalty, no matter the cost. For 29 years, I built my entire identity around keeping the people I loved happy. I thought that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, and gave more than I had, I'd finally earn their respect. But I was wrong, because in my family, respect was never something you earned. It was something my sister Sienna was born with, and I wasn't. If you've ever lived in someone's shadow, if you've ever been the afterthought at your own family table, then you already know how it feels. You start to shrink a little more each year. You stop expecting to be heard. You convince yourself invisibility is safer than rejection. And then one day, someone looks at you, like my brother did that night, and says, "You have 1 week to leave." And you realize you've been erased long before you were asked to go. I want to tell you everything. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. Because somewhere out there, someone's sitting in the same silence I did, wondering if their family would notice if they disappeared tomorrow. By the end of this story, you'll understand what I finally learned the hard way. That sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about shouting or fighting. It's about walking away so quietly that the echo haunts them forever. But before I take you there, before I tell you about the dinner, the betrayal, and the week that changed everything, I need to go back. Because the truth didn't start at that table. It started long before that, in a house where love had rules, and those rules were written for everyone except me. Growing up, I didn't notice the favoritism at first. When you're a child, you assume the world is fair. You think if your sister gets the last cookie, it's because she asked first. If your parents listen to her stories longer, it's because hers are just more interesting. You don't realize it's bias. Not yet. You just think it's bad luck. But luck doesn't explain why every picture frame in our hallway had Sienna's achievements lined up like trophies. The lead in her school play, her debate medals, her best daughter ever mug from some craft fair. And mine? A faded photo from elementary school tucked in the corner, mostly hidden behind a family calendar. Even back then, I felt like background noise in my own home. Mom used to say, "You and your sister are so different." But what she meant was, Sienna shines, and you don't. Sienna had a way of entering a room that made everyone lighter. She laughed loudly, hugged easily, and could charm her way out of any mistake. I admired her once, until I realized she didn't charm, she manipulated. She knew exactly how to say the right things at the right time to get what she wanted. And our parents? They ate it up like sugar. When she crashed Dad's car at 17, they said, "She's just learning." When I dented the fridge door at 16, they said, "Why can't you be more careful?" The difference wasn't in what we did. It was in how they felt about who was doing it. But here's the truth they never saw coming. When you spend your entire childhood being underestimated, you grow into someone dangerous. Not because you want revenge, but because you learn how to survive. I learned to be invisible when it kept me safe. I learned to listen more than I spoke. And I learned that keeping receipts, quiet, invisible proof of every sacrifice, would one day matter more than their approval ever did. Because no matter how small they made me feel, I never stopped paying attention. Years later, when we were adults, that difference between us only grew sharper. Sienna could fail spectacularly, bad relationships, wasted opportunities, and somehow still be their pride. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs through college, graduated without debt, and started paying for their bills when Dad's business collapsed. And you know what I got in return? A thank you message addressed to Sienna. That's when I realized I wasn't invisible by accident. They needed me to stay invisible so their illusion could live. I can still remember one night vividly. Mom had posted a photo online, a big family dinner celebrating Sienna's generosity. She'd written, "So proud of our girl for helping us during tough times." The table I'd just paid for, the meal I'd cooked when I came home from work. And there she was, smiling in the picture, holding a glass of wine like a savior. It wasn't jealousy that burned in me that night. It was betrayal, a deep, quiet kind that doesn't scream. It simmers. It writes itself into the walls of your mind, whispering, "They'll never see you until you stop trying to be seen." So when my brother told me I had a week to leave, I didn't cry. Because the truth is, that wasn't the moment I lost my family. That was the moment I stopped pretending I ever had one. They used to say I was too sensitive. They laughed when I asked for fairness. They said things like, "You're overreacting, Steph." But maybe sensitivity is just another word for awareness. And I was aware, painfully aware, of how easily they erased me. That's why this story isn't just about revenge. It's about something deeper, reclaiming worth in a place that tried to convince you you had none. And if you've ever been through something like that, stay with me. Because by the time this story ends, you'll see what happens when the invisible finally decides to walk away and leaves everyone staring at the empty space they used to fill. The signs were always there. I just didn't want to believe them. But the truth has a way of showing up, even when you're not ready to face it. They say every family has a favorite, but in ours, it wasn't a secret. It was a tradition. From the moment Sienna was born, she became the sun our parents revolved around. And me? I was the quiet orbit in her shadow. I don't think parents ever mean to choose favorites. Sometimes it just happens. But what happens next? That's a choice. When I was 8, I won my school's writing contest. I remember running home, holding that little paper certificate like it was gold. Mom was in the kitchen, on the phone with Sienna's ballet teacher, gushing about how talented she was. I waited, patiently, like I always did, until she hung up. I said, "Mom, look, I won." She smiled for half a second, then said, "That's nice, honey, but can you keep it down?" Sienna's practicing in the living room. That was it. No hug. No, "I'm proud of you." Just a soft dismissal, one of 1,000 more to come. That's how invisibility begins, not with cruelty but with indifference. Sienna didn't mean to be the golden child, not at first, but she learned quickly what earned applause and what didn't, and she liked applause. If she got good grades, there was cake. If I did, there was a nod. If she was sad, the whole house stopped to comfort her. If I cried, I was told to be strong. Over time, that difference starts to carve something inside you, a quiet belief that maybe you deserve less. When we were teenagers, it got worse. Sienna had this natural charm, the kind that made people lean closer when she spoke. She could talk her way out of anything. One time she skipped curfew by almost 3 hours. When Dad confronted her, she started crying. Big, perfect tears. She said, "I was helping a friend, Dad. She needed me." He sighed, hugged her, and said he was proud she cared about people so much. 2 weeks later, I got home 10 minutes late from a school project. Dad was waiting at the door. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "You're becoming careless, Stephanie." And it hit me. It wasn't about actions. It was about who was allowed to be forgiven. Still, I kept trying. I thought maybe if I just worked harder, cleaned more, helped more, stayed out of trouble, they'd see me differently. But that's the trap, isn't it? You keep performing for people who never plan to clap. When I got my first job at 16, I gave half my paycheck to help with groceries. Mom smiled, said thanks, and then told Sienna to pick what kind of dessert she wanted that week. Guess who got the credit for being so thoughtful? Yeah, her. I told myself it didn't matter. That good deeds didn't need to be seen to matter. But that's the lie invisible children tell themselves, until the silence starts to hurt more than the rejection ever did. Then came college. Sienna got a full ride to a private art school. Mom and Dad bragged to every relative, every neighbor, every stranger who'd listen. I got into a public university on a partial scholarship. I remember sitting at dinner, waiting for someone to say, "We're proud of you, too." No one did. Instead, Dad said, "You'll manage, right? You've always been independent, and that was that. No help with tuition, no care packages, no calls, just a quiet expectation that I'd figure it out. Because I always did. And I did. I worked nights, studied days, skipped meals, and still graduated early. Sienna dropped out halfway through her program because it didn't feel right anymore. They said she was finding herself. When I graduated, they didn't even show up. That should have been the moment I gave up on them. But I didn't, because when you've spent your whole life trying to earn love, you don't stop when it hurts. You stop when you're empty. So when Dad's business started collapsing years later, I didn't hesitate. I helped them, quietly. I sent money under a different name so they wouldn't refuse it out of pride. Month after month, I covered bills, repairs, and debts, all while they kept praising Sienna for being their saving grace. It stung, but I stayed silent, because I wasn't doing it for recognition. I was doing it to keep them safe. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But silence has a price, and mine came due one cold December night, the night everything shattered. It started like any other family dinner, the kind where everyone pretends everything's fine, the kind where words are polite but eyes are sharp. Sienna had just announced she was moving back home. Again. She'd burned through another relationship, another job, another fresh start. Mom said it was a blessing to have the family together again. Dad nodded. I was sitting there halfway through my meal, wondering if anyone would notice the irony that I was the only one who'd actually built a stable life, but still felt like the guest at my own table. Then my brother, who usually stayed out of drama, leaned back and said it. 5 words that hit harder than anything I'd ever heard. You have 1 week to leave. At first, I thought he was joking. But then I saw the smirk, the way he looked at me like I was the problem, and my parents, they didn't even flinch. That was the moment I realized this wasn't sudden, it was planned. Later that night, I sat in my room staring at my half-packed boxes. Everything I owned fit into 3 suitcases, years of sacrifice, reduced to luggage. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was numb. Because when betrayal comes from strangers, it hurts. But when it comes from blood, it hollows you out. And as I looked around that house, the one I'd helped keep afloat, the one I'd filled with warmth when no one else did, I realized something. I had never truly lived there. I had only ever rented space in their story. That's when the switch flipped. The version of me who begged for love? She was gone, and in her place stood someone quiet, but deliberate, someone who didn't want to hurt them. She wanted them to see, to finally understand the cost of their blindness. So I decided to give them exactly what they'd earned, a life without me in it. I thought walking away would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. But what I didn't know was, leaving wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of their downfall. It's strange. The moment everything falls apart doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, almost peaceful, like the calm before a storm that's been waiting its turn for years. That night, after my brother's words echoed through the dining room, I didn't fight back. No screaming, no begging, just silence. And that silence scared them more than anger ever could. I remember Mom clearing the table like nothing happened, Dad scrolling through his phone, Sienna pretending to be confused, but I saw it, that little spark of satisfaction behind her eyes. She'd wanted this. She'd finally won. I went upstairs and started packing. Every drawer I opened carried a memory, and every memory was proof of how long I'd been invisible. A handmade birthday card I made for Mom when I was 12, never opened. A photo from my college graduation, folded, not framed. A mug that said, "Best Daughter," bought by me for Sienna. Funny how life hides messages in plain sight. All those years the signs were there. I just refused to read them. But this time, I didn't look away. Because I realized something powerful. You can't lose people who never truly saw you. You can only release them. A week. That's what they gave me. 7 days to erase 29 years. But what they didn't know was, I wasn't planning to disappear quietly. I didn't want revenge in the petty sense. I wanted truth. I wanted them to see what they'd done, to feel the weight of every ignored effort, every stolen credit, every word left unsaid. So I made a plan. The first thing I did was gather receipts. Literally. Bank transfers, emails, text confirmations. Every transaction I'd made to keep that house running. Every utility bill I'd paid. Every anonymous donation I'd sent when they thought Sienna had saved them. I compiled it all. Page after page of proof. Proof that their golden child wasn't their savior. I was. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small holding evidence of my worth. I felt powerful. On the third day, I invited them all to dinner. My treat. Sienna smirked. "Trying to win us over before you go?" she said. I smiled back. Something like that. That night, I cooked their favorites. Mom's rosemary chicken, Dad's mashed potatoes, Sienna's favorite wine. I set the table exactly the way Mom liked it. Everything perfect. Almost too perfect. They ate, they laughed, they pretended we were still a family, and when the plates were cleared, I stood up. I had printed copies of my documents, bound neatly in folders. I placed one in front of each of them. "Before I leave," I said, "I just wanted you to know the truth." They looked confused. Mom opened hers first. She frowned. Dad leaned in. Sienna froze. "What is this?" Dad asked. "Proof," I said quietly. "Proof of everything I've done for this family, every bill, every payment, every sacrifice." I watched their faces shift. Confusion turned to disbelief. Then disbelief turned to shame. Or maybe fear. Mom's voice trembled. "You sent us that money?" I nodded. "For 5 years. When Dad lost the business, when the mortgage was overdue, when you thought Sienna saved you. That was me." Sienna's smile disappeared. Her face went pale. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "You're lying." I met her eyes. "No, Sienna. You're just used to people lying for you." The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't angry. It was hollow, like they were finally seeing the cracks in their own illusion. Dad leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. I laughed softly. "Would you have believed me?" He didn't answer. Then Mom said something that almost broke me, not because it hurt, but because it proved she still didn't get it. She said, "We didn't ask you to do any of that." I looked at her, the woman I had spent my entire life trying to please, and realized that sentence summed up everything wrong with our family. They never asked because they never saw. I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because I thought love meant giving without keeping score. But love without acknowledgement isn't noble. It's self-erasure. That night, I didn't cry. I just felt done. Completely and peacefully done. I stood up, walked to the door, and said, "You wanted me gone? You got your wish. But when you realize what you've lost, don't call me. I won't answer." Then I left. No dramatic music, no slamming doors, just the quiet click of a lock that, for once, felt like freedom. For the next few days, I stayed with a friend. No calls, no messages. The silence was strange, uncomfortable, but pure. It felt like detoxing from years of emotional poison. And then, something unexpected happened. People started reaching out. Family friends, old neighbors, even a few relatives. Apparently, Sienna had been bragging for years about how she single-handedly saved Mom and Dad from bankruptcy. But after that dinner, rumors started spreading. People began to ask questions, and the truth, my truth, started to leak out. I didn't plan it, but I wasn't going to stop it either. By the end of the week, Mom called. I didn't answer. Then Dad texted. "We didn't know. We're sorry I stared at the screen for a long time. Sorry." The word felt empty, a Band-Aid on a wound that had already scarred over. I typed one line back. "You taught me what love isn't." That's enough, and then I blocked the number. But here's the twist most people don't expect. Revenge didn't make me feel triumphant, it made me free. Because I realized I didn't need to punish them. Their punishment was already built into their choices. They would have to live every day knowing the daughter they ignored was the one who held them up. And that kind of silence? That's louder than any scream. Months passed. I moved to a new city, New apartment, new job, new life. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about them, about the empty seat at their dinner table, about Sienna's forced smiles, and I'd wonder if they finally understood what it felt like to be forgotten. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But it didn't matter anymore. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I was living for me. I thought that was the end of my story. But fate had other plans. Because a year later, they came knocking. And this time, the roles were reversed. A full year passed before I saw their names again. 12 quiet months of rebuilding my life, piece by piece, breath by breath. It's amazing how healing begins in silence, how peace feels almost awkward when you've lived your whole life in noise. I'd built something new. A small apartment with light streaming through the windows, a steady job where people actually listened when I spoke, friends who saw me, not for what I could give, but for who I was. For the first time, I wasn't surviving, I was living. And then, one ordinary morning, my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Stephanie, it's Mom. Please, we need to talk." My chest tightened. The words "please" and "we" hit harder than I expected. Because, in our family, those words didn't come easily, and they never came without a reason. At first, I ignored it. But by the end of the week, the messages kept coming. Dad, Sienna, even my brother. Each one different, but all carrying the same tone. Desperation wrapped in politeness. Then one message stood out. "Sienna's in trouble. She needs your help for a moment." I almost laughed. Of course she did. Sienna was always in trouble, but somehow it was always my responsibility to fix it. Still, curiosity has a cruel way of whispering, "What if?" So I answered, not with warmth, just with curiosity. "What happened?" Mom replied instantly. "Please come to the house. We'll explain everything." The next day I drove back, the same road I'd once taken to escape. It felt surreal, like revisiting a nightmare after you've already woken up. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Weeds crawled up the edges of the driveway, paint chipped off the shutters. The illusion of perfection was gone. Finally. When I walked in, the air was thick with tension. Sienna was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red from crying. Mom looked older, exhausted. Dad's shoulders slumped like a man carrying too much guilt. "Stephanie," Mom whispered, "thank you for coming." I didn't sit. I just crossed my arms and waited. It didn't take long for the truth to spill out. Sienna had gotten into serious debt. Again. Only this time, it wasn't something a few phone calls or fake smiles could fix. She'd borrowed money in Dad's name, forged his signature. And now, collectors were threatening to take the house, the same house I had once saved. Dad said quietly, "We don't know what to do." And there it was, the unspoken message beneath the words, "We need you to fix it." I looked at Sienna. She couldn't even meet my eyes. For the first time, the golden child looked tarnished. "Why should I help?" I asked, calm but cold. Mom started crying. "Because we're family." That word, family, it felt heavy in the air. Once it meant everything to me. Now it was just a sound. "Family?" I said softly. "You mean the people who watched me pack my life into boxes while you all pretended I didn't exist?" Dad looked down. Sienna whispered, "I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated. "No, Sienna. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. This is a choice. Just like every time you let me take the blame for things you did." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry. Not anymore. I could have walked away right then. Part of me wanted to. But another part, the one that had waited years for accountability, needed closure. So I said, "I'll help you." But not for free. Not this time. They all looked up, stunned. "What do you mean?" Dad asked. I said, "if I pay off this debt, things change." Permanently, Sienna frowned. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, "because I'm not the same girl who begged for your approval. I'm the woman who rebuilt her life from nothing, and I don't owe anyone here a single thing." For the first time, they listened. Truly listened. So I laid out my terms. Sienna would sign over her share of the house to me. Dad would publicly acknowledge what I'd done, not privately, not in whispers, but in front of our relatives and friends. And Mom would stop rewriting the past to make herself comfortable. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Mom whispered, "That's humiliating." "No," I said. "That's accountability." They resisted, of course. Old habits die hard, but desperation changes people. And by the end of the night, they agreed. I transferred the money the next morning, not because I forgave them, but because I wanted peace. I wanted this story, our story, to finally end. A week later, Dad hosted a small gathering at the house. He stood in front of everyone, cousins, neighbors, friends, and said the words I'd waited my entire life to hear. "We owe everything to Stephanie. She's the reason we still have this home. She's the one who carried us when we didn't deserve it." The room went silent. Every pair of eyes turned to me. And for once, I didn't shrink. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Because that moment wasn't about validation. It was about liberation. After the guests left, Mom approached me quietly. Her voice trembled. "I know I can't fix what we did, but I hope someday you can forgive us." I looked at her. For years, I had dreamed of that apology, but now that I had it, it didn't heal me. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about refusing to let pain own you. So I said softly, "I already did. The day I stopped needing you to understand." Then I walked away. A few months later, I sold the house, not out of spite, but because it wasn't my home. It never had been. The money went into a foundation I started, one that helps women leave toxic family situations and rebuild their independence. I called it the Invisible Daughters Fund, because there are millions of us out there, quiet, capable, unseen, who just need one chance to reclaim their worth. Now, whenever someone asks about my past, I tell them this: I didn't get revenge on my family. I gave them the gift of seeing who I truly was. And the weight of that truth, that's their punishment, not mine. Because the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's walking away stronger, softer, freer, while they're left wondering how the person they ignored became the one they'll never forget. They taught me that silence was survival. I taught myself that voice is freedom. And when I finally spoke, I didn't need to be heard, I just needed to be done. 'Tis been 2 years since that day. 2 years since I stood in that old house and said the words I never thought I'd have the strength to say. Sometimes I still dream about it, not the arguments or the tears, but the silence that came after. That silence was different. It wasn't the kind that hurts. It was the kind that heals. I wake up every morning now with sunlight spilling across my face. No shouting, no guilt, just peace. Quiet, ordinary peace. And somehow that still feels extraordinary. My life is simple now, and I like it that way. I work with women who remind me of myself. People who've spent years trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. People who carry invisible bruises that never show on the skin. We sit together, share coffee, and tell our stories. Every time I see one of them take a deep breath and say, "I finally left," I feel that same small, powerful spark I once felt when I walked out of my parents' house. Freedom isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and patient. It's the sound of keys jingling in your own hand, of footsteps that belong only to you. Sometimes people ask me if I regret helping them, my family, if I ever wish I'd let them face the consequences alone, and I always give the same answer: no. Because walking away angry means you're still carrying the weight of what they did. But walking away free, that means you've learned to let go. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a gift for them, it's a release for yourself. Every now and then, Sienna sends me messages. Not often, just small things. Pictures of her new apartment, a thank you message on my birthday. She's trying, in her own way, to grow up. I don't trust her completely. Maybe I never will. But I don't need to. I don't live waiting for her apology anymore. because when you stop waiting for closure from others, you start creating closure for yourself. As for my parents, we're polite now. Not close, not distant, just quietly at peace. Sometimes Mom calls to ask how work is going. We talk about weather, recipes, small things. There's no blame, no pretending that everything's fine, just two people finally learning how to speak without hurting. Dad's health isn't great these days. He's softer now, more reflective. Once he told me, "I wish I'd been braver when it mattered." And I said, "So do I." It wasn't forgiveness. It was truth. And that was enough. I visit that old neighborhood sometimes, the one where I grew up. The house is gone now, replaced by a newer one. Fresh paint, a different family, a dog barking in the yard. It's strange how something that once felt like your entire world can vanish and life just goes on. I stand across the street, watching the new family laugh through the windows, and I realize I'm not sad. I'm grateful, because that place gave me everything I needed, not love, not comfort, but strength. It taught me that even in the darkest rooms, you can find your own light. Sometimes I still hear echoes, a phrase, a smell, a sound that pulls me back. And for a heartbeat, I feel that old ache again, that tiny, wounded voice inside whispering, "Why wasn't I enough?" But then I remember, that voice isn't mine anymore. It's a ghost, and ghosts only have power if you invite them in. So I breathe in, smile, and let it fade, because now I know the truth. Being enough was never the problem. They just didn't know how to love someone who wouldn't stay small. Now when I look in the mirror, I see someone different. Not the girl who tried to fix everyone, not the woman who carried her family's pain, but someone new, someone whole. Her eyes are steady, her heart is still soft, but her boundaries are steel. And that's what healing really is, keeping your softness even after the world tried to make you hard. When I walk through my apartment now, there are photos on the wall, not of my family, but of the people I've met through the foundation. Women smiling through tears, children finally sleeping soundly, stories of survival turned into strength. Sometimes I catch myself whispering, "This is what love looks like," because it's not about blood or obligation. It's about choice, the choice to show up, to care, to stay kind. If I could go back and talk to that younger version of me, the one who cried herself to sleep because her family made her feel invisible, I'd tell her this: one day, you'll build a world so beautiful you'll forget what it felt like to beg to be seen. And she wouldn't believe me at first. But maybe, just maybe, she'd start to hope. As the sun sets outside my window, I sit with a cup of tea and a quiet heart. I think about everything that's happened, the chaos, the anger, the tears, the transformation, and I realize every painful chapter led me here, every wound became a map, every scar, a reminder that I survived myself. I used to think my story was about revenge, but it's not. It's about rebirth. Final voiceover reflection, outro style. Sometimes the ones who break you aren't villains. They're just people too small to see your worth. And sometimes revenge isn't fire, it's peace. It's waking up one morning and realizing their voices no longer echo inside you. Soft instrumental rise, slow cinematic piano, and ambient reverb. So if you're listening right now and you feel unseen, remember this: you don't have to burn bridges to walk away. You can simply outgrow the ones who refuse to meet you where you bloomed. And as the screen fades to black, I whisper the final line that defines my entire story. My name is Stephanie. I stopped chasing love, and that's when I finally found peace. Screen text for outro. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of strength, betrayal, and redemption. Even after Stephanie's story ends, the question lingers: how many of us are still sitting at that same dinner table, quiet, shrinking ourselves so someone else can feel big? Maybe you've lived it too. The moment when silence felt safer than truth. Maybe your family taught you to disappear just to keep the peace. If that sounds like you, this story wasn't just Stephanie's, it was yours too. Because every time one person walks away from manipulation, someone else watching learns that it's possible. When we built this channel, it wasn't to tell perfect stories. It was to tell real ones. Messy, unfair, and painfully human. Stories where strength doesn't roar, it whispers. And sometimes that whisper is the loudest sound in the room. So if you're still here, listening, breathing, maybe even crying a little, thank you. That means something inside you recognized the truth in these words. And if you did, tell us your story in the comments. You never know. Your experience might be the one that helps someone else finally walk away from their own storm. Before we go, remember, healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel strong, some days you'll fall back into the old ache. That's okay. Progress isn't about never breaking, it's about rebuilding stronger every time you do. So if you haven't already, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because every week we bring stories that remind you, you're not alone. Someone out there has felt exactly what you're feeling now, and made it through. Your silence was never weakness. It was the pause before your comeback. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today.